Okay, stream transitioned or transitioning. Um, People of the internet, give us a thumbs up in the chat box when you can hear us. And we will get started. Welcome to I think, call number 8. So this is our 9th call, which is exciting. I believe you all have the agenda. Here is the agenda if you don't have it, if you haven't seen it. Nothing too crazy on the agenda today. We'll go through the normal things. We have a few things to talk about, open spec discussion, and then that'll be it. First, client updates. No one likes to volunteer, so I'm going to volunteer somebody. How about Xiaowei with Pyvium?
Hi, hello everyone. This week we were implementing the BLS multi-verify function. It's in IVM repository and waiting for more reviews. And hope it will be helpful in generating the test vectors. And the other thing I think we are doing is keep trying to catch up the spec. Yep, that's our updates. Thank you.
Great, thank you. How about Harmony?
Past 2 weeks we've been working on PLS refactor. This refactor had a goal to make our implementation agnostic to elliptic curve mathematics provider. Current implementation is based on Milagro, but after this refactor it could be swapped to any kind of elliptic curve mathematics provider, or even build it, even a custom one. Also, we have been working on simple serialized implementation. We took a consensus low-level implementation and building some high-level stuff like utility which will work with annotations, with annotated classes. It should be pretty handy for simple serialization. And another part of work is abstracting from Ethereum J. So it's still in progress and will be in progress for a couple of weeks. We also touched base with the Pegasus guys, which was pretty nice. And we decided to collaborate on libp2p, on crypto stuff, and testing stuff. Also, there is it's possible to work on say on the same Eth2.0 provider. So there is plenty of things to collaborate on, and we decided to start from libp2p work. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. How about Pegasus?
Hello. My apologies if my voice sounds weird. I'm a little sick. But we decided on a name for our client. It's going to be called Artemis. We have plans for open sourcing, which are in progress right now and coming soon. We have validator registration process in place and raising an event when a new validator is detected. Also, we're in talks with collaborating with Harmony, and we're waiting on getting a PR approved for libp2p daemons so it can interface with Java natively. And that's it.
Great, thank you. Congratulations on the name. Any explanation behind that name that you want to share?
Yeah, so we wanted to stick to like a Greek or Roman god or goddess, since we have Pantheon for our client. And Artemis is the goddess of light, and since it's called a beacon chain, she's also the torchbearer. So since it's called beacon chain, that's why we decided to go with Artemis.
Nice, very cool. Cool. How about Prismatic?
Hey guys, this is Terrence from Prismatic. So things has been slightly slower due to the spec update. We're currently catching up on spec. We're working on Beacon Node refactoring with the latest spec updates. And also with the ongoing refactor, realize it would be ideal to modify how our current sync service function. So previously we split up the sync service between initial sync and the normal sync. So right now we're combining the two services together. We finished that. On top of that, we also implemented the first version of simple serialized spec, which is now implemented in Prism, and that's it.
Awesome, thank you. Nimbus.
Hi. So now we are at most 1 day off the spec, so we're keeping up. We implemented our scheme 3 for BLS signature, so in line with the latest spec from 2 weeks ago. We now have a commit and reveal scheme that can work for right now until we have something more concrete in the spec. We've developed a YAML test generator for shuffling tests. There is a dedicated repo now, so it's not in the NIMBY chain repo. And I will post the link in the chat. It's there. So feel free to put a request for tests. I already have one for BLS signature and aggregation. That was asked by people from our team and other teams. We have a mock gossip sub based on RLPX now in the NIM beacon chain. And regarding Lippy2P pub sub, we have raised a kind of critical issue today. So when we have multiple connections done to the same peer, if one is closed, all others are also closed. So this has been raised to the attention of the Lippy2P team. I'm posting the issue also here. And apparently it's a critical flaw in, well, there's a workaround, but it's something they have to think about. And lastly, regarding community, we started a 2.0 series with introduction to beacon chain, to validators, and transition from proof of work to proof of stake. And the community has been looking into it with interest, and there are some that will be translating those to Chinese and Croatian. So other translations are obviously welcome. And the last link. So that's it for the Nimbus team.
Awesome. Is there somebody here from the Lodestar team? I know Mikira has finals today. And the Lighthouse team had a company holiday party, and it's 1 in the morning after that party, so they left me a note to read to y'all. Pull it up. Their update is that the REST Lippy2P, which I think is managed by Parity, has finished like a major API refactor, which is a blocker for them for utilizing the same repo. And Adrian has begun to implement Gossip Sub now that they've finished that refactor. They've also been refactoring and match the spec updates, been doing a lot of kind of project management stuff, and have been working towards a Q1 beacon chain testnet. Actually, I think Alex Stokes is here, who does some work with Lighthouse. Does that cover most of it, Alex?
Yeah, that's the main thing. And then just, yeah, the spec updates.
Cool. Great. And Parity has an internal workshop right now, so they will not be here. But generally, they're continuing to follow the spec, continuing to ensure that Substrate is going to meet the needs and kind of getting the bones in place. So, but no major update on their end. Great. I didn't miss anyone, right?
I think Zach Cole from White Blocks had some updates from the simulation group, but I don't know if he talked to you about those.
I'm not entirely sure, but we're moving on to research, and that's probably a good place to put it. If you do, you want to start us off? Do you have an update from that end, or a link? I know that there was a call last week, but I did not attend.
Okay, let me find my notes from the call. Okay, so it was a call. We were about 8 people, and the main topic was network emulation. And so they started some nodes, and anyone can join them. And the main issue we were talking about, and that was raised by Alexei, was how to generate activity. And the test plan is there. I put the notes and also relevant links in the chat box. So the next step for the simulation group is coming up with a test plan. So this is the role of Zach and his team. And then he will propose this test plan to us and ask us to collaborate on that. And there is a repo that is in the plan and some generic type of test that everyone can get inspiration from to test on their client. But I think he has a lot more to say, so I'm probably not faithful to what he wanted to say.
No, that's good. That's a good update. And maybe he'll join us next time. Appreciate it. Yeah, Joseph.
Do we ask for update from ChainSafe?
Yeah, Lodestar, ChainSafe. I don't know if anyone joined us today. I know Mikara has finals, and she's usually the one that is able to join our calls.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. You're right. They did put something in the agenda. I think their biggest update is they've changed. They've done a full refactor to utilize TypeScript, which I think is the sane decision if you're in JavaScript. Okay. Cool. So research. We have the testing group is continuing some. The simulation group is continuing some work. Are there any other updates from research?
I have a question actually concerning the simulation. I just look at the link that was shared on the chat, and this is a question that I had previously: is how do you decide the ratio between minor nodes and transaction nodes in the simulations that you are doing?
Honestly, I can't reply, and the best would be to ask Zach Cole on the sharding P2P repo. Just open an issue and ask about how they choose the parameters.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. So research updates. Anybody?
Yeah. So from my side, I have been doing some refactoring also on the simulation, on the simulator that I plan to run in the supercomputer. I added a couple of features. Previously, every single MPI process. So I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with MPI. It's a message processing interface, which is what we use to communicate in supercomputers. Every single process was simulating a single node in the network. And I have changed that into that now one single MPI process can simulate multiple nodes in the peer-to-peer network. So that allows us to do more large scale simulations. And I also added some kind of speed up time feature in which I can speed up time by up to 100 times, so that the execution of the blockchain happens 100 times faster than it would actually happen in real life, to have a much faster results. So that I have been working on those features and a little bit of refactoring. And I had some questions. So, for example, when we look at the spec, so right now I use small sizes for the simulations that I run in right now. Is just basically for testing the software that I am developing. So it's not real size simulations. But when you look at the spec, you have, like, for example, 1,000 shards and 256 validators per shard. And I wanted to ask how this compares to the current number of nodes that we see in the Ethereum network, right? So if you think about the number of validators for that spec, you think about almost to 60,000, which is not the number of nodes that we have, I think, right now in the Ethereum network. So I don't know, how is this? I mean, are we thinking about, I don't know, starting with I don't know, less number of shards at the beginning, and as the number of validators increase the number of shards, or what is the plan on this?
Right. So the number of validators per shard actually scales. It is scaled, I think, in like a function called get current shuffling. And so essentially, if you reach a certain threshold of validators, then per cycle you do cross-link all shards in. But if you do not reach a minimum threshold, then it starts taking multiple cycles to cross-link all the shards, so that you don't have too few in your committees that are cross-linking. So to answer your question, the number of shards is to be fixed. The minimum number of validators for this to begin is defined by a constant chain start full deposit threshold, which is 16. It's 2 to the 14th, 16,384. So another thing to consider is that these validators are 32 ETH instances, and in all likelihood, a lot of actual physical nodes in the network will represent multiple validator instances. I don't have a good handle on what we expect that kind of distribution to be, but say we have 300,000 validators, and we have the same number of nodes in the network today, so say on the order of 16,000, that's like 18, 19 validators living actually in each node, and participating in multiple shard subnets. So in that case, when you're doing simulations, we have to make some sort of assumptions about distribution of how many actual validator instances are in a physical node. And so yes, we do expect more of these discrete validator entities, but I don't know how much we expect the total physical node count to grow. Vitalik or Justin or anyone, have you thought about how we expect some of these numbers to grow and scale?
Sorry, I was not paying full attention. The numbers, is it the number of validators, and the number of validators is per shard, is that right?
No, more of, given, say we have 10 million ETH validating, we have on the order of like 300,000 validators, how many, the actual distribution of nodes on the network, say, I think right now we have like 10 to 15,000 nodes on the network. Do we expect to have a similar amount of nodes on the network and just to have many validator entities crunched into each one, or what you think that distribution might look like?
It's hard to tell now. I think we'll definitely see a power law distribution of some kind.
Right.
I mean, in terms of logical identities, there'll be one per validator. And in terms of physical, like computers and IP addresses, I guess it's hard to tell. One kind of nice thing is that the amount of resources required for a validator, as in like a node with multiple validators, grows linearly up to a point, up to roughly, I guess, 1,000 validators. So if you have small validators, relatively small validators that are not pooling, then that should lead to a lot of physical machines. But it's hard to predict how much pooling will happen.
Right, but this ratio I think is important because when you consider when you want to consider a number of bad actors, most likely all the validators running in the same node, if one of those validators is a bad actor, it's most likely that all of the validators in the same physical node are bad actors because the node belongs to the same person and probably will be using the same software. And so this is why this ratio is interesting when we want to do simulations, because that give us some kind of hints on what the number of bad actors, really, what would be the impact of that,
Well, I don't think you can assume that actually, because there will be, you could have a beacon chain being hosted, by Infura or something in a ton of validator clients connecting to that one. Some of them could be bad actors and some of them not.
Sure.
Well,
yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, for example, if we assume that one of the, we have today about roughly, I don't know, 15,000 nodes. If we think that one of the nodes that we have running today will be transformed into, say, 10 validators when sharding comes, the person taking care of the node that runs today will probably apply the same for all the validators that person will run. I mean, this is what I mean. I'm not talking about the IP address. I agree, if you can have the same IP address and still have different virtual machines running different persons, different software, different clients. But I'm talking about if you transform the number of nodes that we have today in the network into a higher number of validators, then that is likely to be the case that the same person, if he's a bad actor, might be account for multiple bad validators.
Agreed. Right. So I guess moving forward in the simulations is just to be able to capture that notion of a physical entity representing multiple parties within the network, multiple validators within the network, and then maybe we can figure out, some sort of distribution on the size of these validator instances within per node.
I had a question about this, like the way the system performs when more or less validators come and go. And my intuition right now is that it scales basically this way, that if we start seeing that there are few validators, like in times when there are not so many or not so many nodes, we'll have 1,024 slow nodes. And then in times when we have a lot of validators, very many validators, we'll still have 1,024 nodes, and there'll be an upper bound on how fast those are. So in terms of scalability that way, that would be something I would be interested to see a few thoughts and graphs on, in terms of what the bounds are for when the system is viable, for when it becomes interesting to start thinking about more or less shards and concerns like this.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. In times of low validators,
yes, so the system doesn't scale dynamically in terms of number of shards, right? So what we're scaling with instead is how fast the shards get validated. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, we're scaling two things, at least in the current spec. One of them is basically how frequently crosslinks appear, and so what the load is on the beacon chain. And the second thing is that if at least, I'm not sure if any of this is actually in phase 0, it might only be in the phase 1 file right now, but if the number of validators is too small, then we allow some of them to not submit proofs of custody. And so the assumption will be that the majority of the cross-link validators won't, or at least some of the cross-link validators won't actually be doing full validation and full proof of custody generation. They will just be basically either validating data availability proofs or something similar.
Yeah, right. Yeah, indeed.
I'm not sure to understand this because when we have less validators, I would expect the few validators to do more work. But what you are saying is that when we have less validators, then some validators do less work?
So the idea is that to compensate for the fact that if we have fewer validators, each one would have to do much more work, we instead allow, in the case where there are a few validators, we allow some of them to not submit the proof of custody bits. And this allows us to basically what this means is that they would have to check more blocks, but for most of the blocks they would be able to basically skip doing most of the work.
Okay.
Right, so essentially random sampling on who has to do the hard work so that your resource requirements stay close to constant, even though you're distributed across more of the network.
Got it.
So I guess the general idea from a design perspective is to do some sort of graceful degradation. And we could have a dynamic number of shards, but reducing the number of shards is something that's very disruptive. So it's not so graceful. And so in terms of things that we can do gracefully is what Vitalik talks about, which is reducing the frequency of the crosslinks and not requiring so many proofs of custodies when we don't have that many validators. And things we can also do with the execution layer is reduce the gas limit.
Yeah, that or even skipping slots, but I suppose that's a similar mechanism.
Well, it also depends on how dynamic you want the system to be. I understand changing the number of shards is costly if you change every hour or so. But if you for example start with 100 shards and then every month say you reevaluate this, then is that cost that heavy?
In terms of unifying state, I think there's much complexity there. I'm not sure the actual computational cost.
But the problem is not increasing the number of shards. That's easy. The problem is decreasing the number of shards. And there could be some sort of catastrophic situation where the number of validators just drops by a factor of 10 from 1 week to another, and we wouldn't want to reduce by 10 the number of shards.
And granted, a lot of these graceful degradation scenarios are scenarios of incredibly decreased security, but that's just, even though performance is degrading, but security is kind of falls off a cliff at some point, but it's just kind of the nature of the beast if you don't have a lot of validators participating.
Yeah, well, like if there is only something like less than 1 million ETH validating, then security is in some ways like hugely degraded anyway. So.
Right, so doing major things like trying to reduce the number of shards like really doesn't even get you that far in terms of like increasing security at the cost of complexity.
Yeah, no, I was not thinking about decreasing. I was mostly thinking about increasing, kind of like for a bootstrap, for like when we actually start sharding, so that at the very, very beginning, we don't have 300,000 validators. I was thinking about just starting with different number and then increase slowly as the number of validators increases. I understand decreasing is much more challenging, yeah.
And will it make sense to make the slot time more dynamic? So if there are less validators available or less resources available, you have much more time to validate.
Right. I mean, that's a similar trade-off to just reducing the number of crosslinks per epoch. And it's a similar trade-off in reducing, say, the gas limit in shards by if you increase the slots or the slot length or skip certain slots. I think all of those kind of linearly reduce load and are viable. But I think I don't know. I don't see much changing the slot length. Kind of, I think, is maybe changes the regularity of these events, and so maybe changes the speed with which they can become fixed. If like they can mend themselves, if say a number of validators do come online. So I think keeping slot length is probably healthy. The same is probably a healthier way to go.
Yeah, maybe.
Fundamentally, having less validators causes bandwidth issues, not latency issues. So we should address the bandwidth, by reducing the block size or reducing the gas limit or things like that. But changing the, we don't have to compromise on latency, and increasing the slot duration compromises unnecessarily on latency.
Right. And again, if you make epochs take longer and you keep the same validator churn quotient, then you're taking longer for the network to maybe get into a healthy spot again by inducting new validators. Cool. Fun stuff. Any more comments on that before we move on to any other research updates? Okay.
Sorry, I want to update
Yes, please.
The question from Leo. I just left some comment in the chat room about the number of the testing plan. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in terms of updates on my side, I guess I just wanted to give some visibility into significant changes that will happen to the spec. So one of the things we're considering is to pull out validator balances separate from the registry. The idea here is that the balances are updating very frequently for the validators, but not so much the rest. And so we can, for example, save on the hashing, do less hashing at every epoch.
Right, and because we moved to CACAC 256, that might be a requirement just to reduce the load per epoch on the hashing. I will say, in terms of actual implementation, you still have the same validator, you still have the same index into that that entity. So I think it's actually kind of minor on the actual implementation side, but significant from a kind of slight data structure rework.
Right. In terms of data structure reorg, we are considering merging some of the fields for justification and finality. So right now we have 4 different fields, and we could merge them all into a single bit field that basically grows by 1 bit per epoch, and that bit represents whether or not the epoch was justified. And beyond being cleaner, it has other advantages like being more flexible. We're considering adding more Randall mixes to the state, the recent Randall mixes. And we also have to include various placeholders for example, for the proofs of custody and the VDFs. But hopefully these will just be additions to the existing data structures. In terms of significant changes, I think there will be some simply through all the bug fixing that will happen. So we've identified and fixed a lot of bugs in the last 2 weeks, but I still think there's a lot of unidentified bugs, on the order of at least 50, and it kind of needs academic review. I see 3 things. One is the fork choice rule, and I think we have Ido Bentoff who's looking at that. We also need to have a review of the BLS hash function, and it's possible we'll ask Dan Bonnet or Benedict Bones to look at that. And there's also new logic around the justification and finalization for Casper FFG. And I guess more people need to look at that and try and break it, or maybe we should go ahead and prove that it's correct. So yeah, that's it from my side.
Justin, on Casper and on the proof, one of my concerns on the old paper, the 1 year old paper, was the fact that it wasn't proven for fairness. So, I mean, it was possible for Casper FFG to be live and safe, but for example, for a single miner to generate all the blocks. If you see what I mean. It can be live, it can be safe, but a single miner has taken ownership of the blockchain. Okay, I'm speaking here about the old version of Casper FFG, the one that was supposed to go on top of proof of work. And how do you feel about this? The fact that we're not really speaking about fairness, and the fact that if we prove liveness and safety without fairness, that we can have some holes in the system, I will say.
Right. The analysis moves out towards the way attestations are happening, in that many validators get to participate on the consensus on the fork choice of each block being proposed, and beyond that, out to the way that group rewards and penalties are calculated, and that the more participants in the consensus, the higher the rewards are there. But agreed. So in general, especially because of the attestation-driven fork choice, I believe that it is actually more resistant to, say, single miner takeover. But I do agree that just safety and liveness doesn't finish your analysis, and that there's analysis around incentive compatibility that absolutely should be done. Vitalik, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, and I definitely think analyzing the incentive compatibility and stability and various other properties is really important. I guess so far all that we really have to work off of are kind of existing arguments that we know of about Ghost. The one thing that still makes me feel uncomfortable is kind of the stitching between the Ghost and Fortress rule and the finality gadget, and that seems to be like, if there are issues, that seems like one of those areas where there could be some weird kink.
That's where the flip-flop issue arose, is the stitching, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is also one of the reasons why I kind of like Casper CBC in the long term, because it actually doesn't require this awkward, weird stitching thing.
Right.
But on the topic of the problem with block proposers having this monopolistic issue because you only have a single proposer who has full control over the next block, I agree with Danny. I think to a very large extent that has been addressed with attestations. And another name for attestations that I like is co-proposers. So basically you have a committee that is invited to co-propose with the proposer, and the proposal only goes through if the co-proposers agree that this is, you know, a proposal that makes sense in the sense that it's building on top of the tip.
I don't really like that way of phrasing things because the proposer does have like very real power of choice about what things go in the block, and realistically, the attesters have basically close to zero leverage to influence that decision. The best that they can do is reject the block if it's invalid.
Yeah, they're co-signers.
Yeah, well, I don't like co because the word co implies a relationship of equality. Like, I think whatever word we use should imply an explicitly subordinate relationship.
Fair enough.
Right, it's strictly weaker, so it doesn't address things like censorship. So the proposer can create an empty block if they want, but it does address things like trying to build on top of an ancestor and trying to do short-term
Exactly
takeover attacks and things like that.
Yep.
Cool. Any other research updates? Nicola, anybody from the Pegasus team, research team, have anything to share?
Yes, so we continue to work on the aggregation stuff. So it will be my update for Torrents, I guess. This paper actually is still under writing, but has been accepted at the conference in Stanford end of January. So we will be there. We spent some time on the network part again, and on the anonymity and privacy of validators. And one of the options that we looked at is, we just started to look at is using something like Tor or I2P, so basically networks for privacy. I2P being used on Monero. I2P was looked at a kind of EIP was defined a year ago, I think, on Ethereum by someone from Parity, but it was finally cancelled. So I don't know if some people have any background on that. I created a GitHub issue on the P2P repo. So if anyone has insights and opinion on this, it could be quite interesting.
Nicola, are you really close to your mic? Can you pull it just away a little bit?
I'm next to it, but
we're just having problems hearing you.
Okay, so everything is a GitHub issue, so have a look at it. I'm interested in feedback here. Thanks. I'm sorry for the microphone.
Hey, Nicola, I think it's even worse now.
Sorry, we missed most of that. I think you're looking into privacy network protocols such as Tor and something else.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We lost a lot of that. Okay. Now I'm getting a lot of feedback now. Okay. I think we're going to move on from there. I apologize. It was tough on the hardware today. Yannick, or anybody that's been working on any of the P2P research, is there any update on that?
Not really. Maybe one thing. I've talked to Felix a little bit, and he was very happy if we that we considered choosing Discovery version 5, and we basically discussed how we can help and how to get the spec ready. And he mentioned 3 things that we can do. The first one is finding gaps in the spec, so things that are not talked about or only touched briefly upon. The second thing is to formalize it. I'm not sure how we can do this best. I guess that's for later. And the third thing, I can't remember. Wire protocol. There's no there are no messages or anything defined. So this is also something that we have to work on. Yeah, that's all I have. And if we want to open issues and talk about this kind of stuff, it's best to do this in the Ethereum Dev P2P repository. That's it.
Great, thank you. If anybody has familiarity with P2P discovery protocols, it'd be a great place to get contributing to, because you know, this is going to be, as we want to have clients talking to each other, even if they're the same client, we're going to have to figure this out sooner rather than later. Cool. Any other research updates?
Hey, Danny, can I jump in and just ask a quick question about the assumption, you know, with the you know, if one validator is bad on a node, all of the validators are bad. Is that considering potentially the possibility of someone setting up you know, like a node hosting service and allowing the validators to independently connect to it?
No, yeah, I mean, that's there is definitely a world in which somebody can run a node and sell data, say, to validators so that they can sign their own messages and broadcast them without having to handle the full requirements of running a node. In that case, that assumption fails. In the case in which validators running their own setup, then yeah, many validator entities tied to a node would be corrupt if one was corrupt, very likely. In terms of incentives and security, I'd like to try to construct the system in which it lends to validators not outsourcing, just because I don't want to see the network degrade into a handful of master nodes just serving data.
Okay.
But
okay, good. That was my follow-up question: is what do we need to do in order to prevent that from happening, if that's what we're concerned about?
Right. Vitalik, Justin, thoughts? I know kind of the non-outsourceability of proof of custody does a little bit of that, is then you actually have to store the data on your own, but that doesn't really fix the requirement that you're a full node. It just requires that you got this data from a full node.
Well, it comes close to requiring you to be a full node, at least in the downloading sense, for all the way up until we start talking about state execution. I mean, in general, like it's hard to incentivize the property of actually being a node in the sense of serving other nodes in protocol, because you could always just basically pretend to serve yourself. So if that ends up being necessary, then the only realistic way to do that is to basically have things like markets for where basically a node connects to another node and pays it inside of a state channel in exchange for services or something like that.
But you think the argument of having, because you have to download the data and do the proof of custody on your data, then
it'll definitely make it cheaper, and like people who are lazy will definitely like just run the full node software and use it instead of trying to do some fancy cheap thing where they do literally only the minimum necessary. I mean, I definitely agree that, like, I personally am not worried about a node count crisis, but if that's what we end up getting, there are ways around it.
Right. And I mean, there's some amount of honesty assumption in that a validator is going to like do the full participation in the network, but I don't want to make that honesty assumption too strong.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, I think it's an honesty assumption that only a few percent of validators really need to be honest, and if that, in that sense, and if that happens, then there will be enough to serve everyone else.
Right. But definitely worth considering kind of like these worst case scenarios in which a handful of supernodes are just trying to serve all the data to you know, very thin validators.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question about the proposers. So I just did some quick math. Like with 100,000 proposers, it looks like you'll do one proposal every 7 days roughly. Does that sound familiar?
Is that a beacon proposal?
Yeah.
We can calculate right now, right? It's like 6 seconds for a slot. So in order, if you have about 1,000 proposers, then you get one per day. So at about 90,000, or sorry, 90,000 validators, you would get to one per week. And if you go all the way up to like 1 million, then you get one every month. So yeah, it's.
Is the frequency of that a concern that you don't get to do so many proposals? Is that like what's the play here?
Why would you?
It's an operation you just don't perform very often. I don't know. You have to be available for a very short period of time.
You're available for that short period of time on every epoch for being part of a committee. It's like an additional rare duty on top of your committee duties that awards you extra capital. So it's worth paying attention to, I believe. I don't think it's like a major hindrance.
All right, cool. Regarding the peer-to-peer network planning stuff, just to clarify, like from Nimbus at least, we're just going to run over any network for the next month, and indeed we're going to start looking at it early next year to sort of properly implement that. I don't know how the other groups are approaching this issue.
I think that's
but we're basically going to run it over dev-B2B, probably unless we're lucky with lib-B2B.
Yeah, I think that's a sane approach. Does do any other clients want to comment on their current strategy?
In PyVM, we do the same thing. We also build it on dev-B2B for now.
Cool. Let's move on to the next agenda item, which is the low-hanging fruits for testing by Mami. Do you want to chime in, Mami?
Yeah, so they are part of the spec that are pretty much standalone. And if I can, shuffling, if I have everything in the spec, I just copy paste in my test generator, and we can have shared test vectors in YAML. If some are missing, like BLS, I just ask PyVM if they have some kind of implementation that we can use, like a blessed one from the EF. And if you have some suggestions about test vectors, feel free to open a PR on the test gen repo. The goal is to push that upstream, so in the ETH2 tests, once we have something solid and that we know that other people can consume. But for now, I'm using the status repo because it's easier to attribute for me.
Great. I've been about to dig in and help you here. Been focused mainly on spec, but I'll spend some time on testing next week or two. And on the terms of blessed PyVM side, we're doing a lot of catch-up work over there. So, on the order of a couple of weeks, we'll be in a similar spot where we can begin sharing some testing.
Okay. So, well, if you know any low-hanging fruit that are pretty much implemented directly in the spec, feel free.
Cool. Will do. Great. The next thing is the unsigned underflow or flow. There's kind of been an ongoing discussion around this. Does anybody want to catch us up on the call?
So that's another item I put because it was raised twice in the past 2 weeks by Jacek and Paul Hauner from Sigma Prime. I think we should have, I don't know how, maybe just remove the minus from the spec and just use the plus everywhere, or at least put some. I talked last call about some kind of implementer good practices, and maybe the sidiness potential issues should be put in there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do want to move towards the plus. I think that we did add that in a few spots. But as Paul pointed out, that anything coming in from a user might actually just be very high values that mess up that plus and cause overflows, even though they're highly unlikely because most of them are related to slots. But if it's user supplied data, they can cause that. So it doesn't fully fix it. I think it's better. But some separate best practice document, I think, would be a fair thing to start on. Jacek, I know you've kind of, in a similar vein, want to define what the scope of reasonable values are for most of these variables. Do you have a proposal on what form that would take and where that would live?
Well, there's two things. One is, I don't know, as a community and as a network, we want to be offering to our users certain guarantees that the system will continue to run for whatever time, right?
Right.
And that requires that all the clients implement the spec with support for some minimal values in terms of how many slots we'll be able to process and so on, like just for the general health of the network, right? So those are minimum values, and then and I haven't exactly analyzed which ones are the most important ones, but obviously slots, right? We can agree as implementers that this will be something that every client supports, and we can give this guarantee to users as well, right? Like, that's the kind of thing that I'd consider interesting. The other one is for the implementation and for the overflows, for example, if one were to follow all the various constants and formulas in the spec, you would be able to establish a bound, an upper bound on where no overflows happen, for example. So let's say we support 200 years of slots. That means that it's mathematically guaranteed that we can use, I don't know, int64 here and whatever else there. So those are good guarantees to be able to build. And what happens then is that we can not.
You're fading. I can't hear you anymore.
Oh, sorry. Better now?
Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah, so many of these would come from sort of the problem.
Again, you entirely faded out. We can't hear you at all.
All right.
Now we can
now?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a bit of a mess here. So you can mathematically derive these things, and that would come out of a formal implementation of the spec. I'm not sure how much of that will happen January or March or whatever, but I would see this as a help and a quality improvement of any implementation, really.
I think I generally agree. In terms of where this information might live, I think it might be in an accompanying document rather than embedded into the phase 0 document. And I mean, if you want to begin to lead the charge on that, I'm very open to incorporating a separate document that kind of defines some of these values for the community and users in general.
Yeah, I'm going to explore it a little bit more. I think it's much more viable now that the spec is starting to slow down a little bit.
Yeah. Maybe this is a mid-January activity.
Yeah, so there's no hurry on that one right now. I mean, it's nothing we have to solve now. But yeah, I'll see if I can formalize that thought a little bit more concretely.
Sounds good. Okay, so we haven't necessarily solved the underflow overflow problem. We know it is a problem and need to make sure that we address it.
Danny, since you suggested 3 times that we should put the things in accompanying document, should we create a repo for that, or can we use maybe not?
Go on.
Maybe not the ETH 2.0 specs because it's quite busy already, and we want to keep that focus. But should we create a new like ETH 2.0 implementers guide?
I actually would lean on the direction of just making a new folder. Well, because the issues in PRs make it crazy. For now, I would lean towards making a new folder, and if we need to pull it out, I'd rather these things live closely together.
Yeah, that's true.
For the time being, if it gets too crazy, we might move it in a different direction. But I think we can handle the complexity in one repo. Anything other related to the last couple things we're talking about? Before we move on to, which we did a handful of this kind of throughout, but the just general spec questions, comments, discussion, anything? Okay. As for doing another formal meetup and get together, or concerted, concentrated, whatever, getting us all together in a physical location. On the research team, we're erring on the side of not doing anything in Q1. That kind of causes us all to gather in one location. Specifically, obviously, there's always kind of stuff going on, so if some spontaneous meetups happen, let them happen. But we're thinking maybe in April that we target April to get everyone together, you know, and keep Q1 just like really focused on work, and then gather ourselves together in April and begin to solve the next string of problems. And right now, I don't really know what that gathering would look like exactly. Maybe it'll be us getting clients to talk to each other. Maybe it'll be us hashing out state execution proposals. Maybe, who knows? Does that sound generally reasonable? Great. Any other further discussion on anything at all kind of related to
Hey,
this?
Danny.
Yeah.
I just wanted to chat about a topic that's been, it's been a frequent question getting asked to us at Prismatic. So with respect to like issuance overall for Ethereum, I mean, the idea is that eventually, people that have their private keys will have the same amount of ETH as they did on Eth 1.0 once we migrate the whole state of 1.0 to 2.0. So the question is, in the meantime, before we migrate the state, there's going to be, validators earning rewards basically, and overall the issuance of Ethereum, the cumulative issuance will go up, right? So, I mean, have you guys thought about this? How the transition will happen? What will happen to the economics of ETH throughout that process, etc. Just wanted to spark a discussion around that topic.
There's a lot there. One, the issuance to validators is generally marginal compared to the issuance to miners, so I don't see it as a major. We're decreasing to 2 relatively soon on the proof of work chain, and we'd be increasing a marginal amount when we create the beacon chain.
Sure.
And then beyond that, there is a proposal floating around to do kind of like this hybrid proof of work, proof of stake proposal where you begin to utilize the beacon chain for finality. In terms of issuance, the community seems to like reducing issuance on the proof of work chain, so maybe depending on the economics over there, and depending on if that proposal is adopted, the community might push for further issuance reductions on the proof of work chain. I'm not going to be, charging for that political move just because I'm going to stay focused on the technicals. Over time, ultimately, issuance will go down when the system is entirely proof of stake. And during that time, yes, validators can move stake over through this deposit contract, but when state execution exists on shard chains, there will likely be another enshrined transfer contract or deposit mechanism to move from Eth2.0 to 2.0. There's a lot of little things to think about and how that transition happens, but I don't know if I'm going to solve it all right here on this call.
Got it. So in that case, it doesn't make sense to talk about release unless it's phase 1 upwards, right? Like to mainnet.
Release what?
To do like a mainnet launch of any sort of client.
Mainnet of like a beacon chain? A mainnet of...
Yeah. Like, should we go live basically with phase 0, or should we go live until phase 1? And
I think we should go live with phase 0 because getting a live proof of stake chain is no small feat, and managing complexity in such a way that like we can make sure this works, and then we can add this and make sure that works, and we can add this and make sure that works. I think is rather than doing it in a slightly semi-mainnet conditions is, I think, going to give us much more valuable feedback, and rather than waiting till phase 1 or phase 2 to launch anything. Obviously, if phase 1 is like all that shit's ready, then we could consider launching it together. But I personally think it's wise to launch phase 0 without the phase 1, because there's only so many proof of stake blockchains out there, and I think I want to get it right. Any other thoughts on that?
No, thank you. It's pretty clear. Thank you.
Cool. And also with respect to just interest rate and issuance in this full proof of stake system, there's an issue open in the Eth2.0 specs repo about discussion on this. There's a guy, Eric, can't remember his last name, who's running GitHub. Oh no, not GitHub, ETHub, and GitHub. Running ETHub, and he's been doing a lot of different economic analysis and stuff, and I think there's still much room for the community to get involved in that conversation.
Regarding that, he put something on Reddit because CFTC, which is a commission of commodity trading in, I don't know the full acronym, so is asking everyone to contribute to reply to them about the purpose of Ethereum, why Ethereum, when Bitcoin exists, and things like this. So
yeah, I saw that. It's a pretty cool effort. Someone should share the link if they have it. And looked like there were some tougher questions at the end about proof of stake and implications of when you make derivative contracts on ETH and how that affects the security model. Okay, anything else?
Yes, concerning the meeting in April, I don't know if the location has been already decided, but if not, I would like to propose Barcelona.
Thank you. I love Barcelona. What is it? EdCon is in Sydney, and a bunch of us are going to go to that. That's kind of what's been talked about a little bit, but obviously we need to figure out if a lot of people are going to go to that or not before we lock in a date. I'd love to do something in Barcelona in 2019 regardless.
Yeah, I think even if not spring, like Barcelona is the place to do it in Europe. It seems like it makes a lot of sense.
Great.
Cool. Any other anything? Great. Thank you very much. The holidays are coming up, so I'm not sure exactly when we're going to have our next meeting. Likely first or second week of January rather than in the end of December, early January time. But we can communicate on the sharding getter. As always, be in touch. A lot of excellent work going on. Let me know if you have any questions, comments between now and then, and stay tuned with the specs and all that. Thank you, everyone. It's a good meeting. Talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, all.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.